This research project will be about tourism in Amsterdam city centre, adapting form and function. As we all know, Amsterdam city centre is camping with a bit of a tourism problem. Quite often you can hear Amsterdam citizens complaining about how the centre is no longer accessible due to the enormous amounts of tourists from all over the world that visit the city every year, and the statistics support this. In the year 2019, Amsterdam was visited by more than 9 million tourists, most of which came from foreign countries. This is of course far more than any other city in the Netherlands. To make a quick comparison, Rotterdam is the second biggest city when it comes to tourism, and it was visited by only 1.2 million tourists in 2019. Obviously, a huge difference. And tourism in Amsterdam is still on the rise. The number of visitors in 2019 had increased by 9% when compared to 2018, a number which is once again bigger than it is in any other city in the Netherlands. Of course, there are plenty of reasons for this. Amsterdam has a large amount of different tourist attractions, from museums and historical buildings to coffee shops and the red light district. There seems to be something for everyone. It is no surprise that tourism has had an effect on the buildings of Amsterdam city centre. Quite often we see how old buildings with a lot of history are now being transformed to serve a more modern purpose, perhaps one that caters to tourists. We will be taking a look at a few of these historical buildings and see how their form and function have changed over the years, and if this can be attributed to the growing number of tourists over the years. The main research question that I strive to answer is, how have the form and functions of Amsterdam city centre changed in order to cater to tourism? In order to research this, we will take a look at a certain square in Amsterdam city centre which is very popular with the tourists, and also happens to have a lot of history. This is of course Leidseplein. I've made a collage with several different pictures of Leidseplein throughout the ages. I will be comparing these pictures, discuss how form and functions of the square have changed over the years, and in which way they are connected. First off, a little history on Leidseplein. The square was first constructed in 1660, around the time when the famous Amsterdam canals were also being constructed. The square's original function was to be a parking space for horse wagons. The idea would be that people would leave their wagons on Leidseplein before they would head into the city centre. This would be the square's main function for over 100 years, before the city theatre was constructed there, which added a cultural function as well. And Leidseplein is of course also known as the intersection for several different electric tram lines. This became a function of Leidseplein in 1875, but instead of electric trams, there were horse trams at the time. We can see an example of one of these horse trams on the left picture. These trams were updated to electric ones in 1900, when the first electric tram line in Amsterdam was opened. This line went from Leidseplein to Haarlemmermeerplein, and it still runs to this day as part of Tram Line 10. We can see Line 10 in 1934 on the right picture. Nowadays, there are several other tram lines in Amsterdam, including lines 2, 5 and 12. On the left picture we can see Tram Line 10 on Leidseplein in 1964, and on the right we can see Tram Line 5 on 2013, the modern day, so to speak. Of course, Leidseplein is also known for its extensive nightlife. There are a lot of cafes, nightclubs and restaurants located on or near the square, which are hugely popular among tourists. Now that we have discussed some of the basic functions of the square, we can discuss how its functions and form have changed over the years. We will take a look at a few different historical buildings on Leidseplein in order to determine this. An example of this that we will be taking a look at is the Hirsch-building, which is a building that has served quite a lot of different functions over the years. There have been several buildings on the spot where the current one stands, which were owned by the Belgian fashion company Hirsch&C. This was a company with establishments throughout Europe that produced fashion for women and mostly catered to the elite. For example, the Dutch queens Wilhelmina and Juliana were both known to buy clothes at Hirsch&C. We can see one of their old buildings on the picture on the left. You can't see it very well, but it's the middle building right behind the tree. Eventually, Hirsch&C decided that this building was too small, and that instead of expanding it, they would be better off tearing it down and building a new one in its place, This new Hirsch-building began construction in 1910 and was finished 2 years later. You can see the blueprint of this old building in the picture on the right. However, Hirsch and She wouldn't use the entire building for too long. In 1946, there were already other companies using different parts of the building. These companies included several different airlines, British, American and Argentinian, a tourist center and a photographic workshop. Different companies would keep using parts of the building until 1976, when Hirsch and She was disbanded and therefore stopped using the building in its entirety. Nowadays, the building is of course most well known for housing the Apple Store, which can be seen on the right picture. One thing that is obvious when looking at the Hirsch building throughout the ages is that although the function of the building has changed, to a certain degree, the form has mostly remained intact. Of course, you can see the advertisements on the companies that it used to house on the left picture, which are no longer present nowadays. In a sense, the building still features its original exterior form. Also take note of the Hirsch and She sign on the dome of the building, which functions as a reminder of the building's roots. As you can see on these pictures, there's also been made an effort to keep the original form of the building, not just in the exterior, but also on the interior. However, as the function of the building changed over the years, some of the form naturally changed with it. And while some of the original architectural style has been preserved, there have also been several modern additions to the building, like the glass staircase. In conclusion, I don't think the change in function of the Hirsch building is a direct result of the tourism in Amsterdam, seeing as the building has housed different companies throughout almost its entire history. However, seeing as Apple is a hugely popular company in a big part of the world, the Apple Store might draw even more tourists to Leidseplein in the future. Another prominent building on Leidseplein is the old police station, which can be seen in the left picture. This was station number 14 in Amsterdam, and began construction in the year 1900. However, in 1985 the police station moved to a different location, and the building was bought by the Bulldog. The Bulldog is a company in Amsterdam which has several different branches, like cafes, lounges, etc., but it's probably most well known for its coffee shops. Bulldog has several different locations throughout Amsterdam, in which they sell marijuana, including one in the red light district, and they're mostly focused on tourists. Of course, nowadays Amsterdam has a reputation around the world for its policy in regard to soft drugs, and just how normal and accepted use of marijuana seems to be here. We cannot deny that at least a significant portion of the tourism in Amsterdam can be attributed to this. On average, coffee shops in Amsterdam get around 1.5 million tourist visitors per year. In a survey which questioned foreign tourists in Amsterdam, from the ages 18 to 35, 65% admitted to using marijuana. 34% of the tourists said that they would visit Amsterdam less often if they would not be allowed to buy marijuana, and 11% even said that they wouldn't visit it at all if this were the case. This gives us a clear indication of just how much of Amsterdam's tourism can be attributed to our marijuana policy. One cannot miss the irony of a former police station now being used as a coffee shop, which would be especially apparent to tourists from countries which have a much stricter policy in regards to marijuana. However, in this case, most of the original form of the building remains intact. The changes to the exterior of the building have mostly been contained to the first floor, which, as you can see, now features a glass overhang with the Bulldog signs and logos. Notice the old plaque that is still present between the logos. The reason that the form of the upper floors has remained intact is because the functions of the floors have also not changed. Even when the building housed the police station, the upper floors have always been apartments, which they still are to this day. I have previously already discussed the city theater on Leidseplein. However, there were actually two city theaters in its history. We can see the old one on the left side, which stood there until 1890, and the new one on the right side, which was built in 1894, and is still there to this present day. In the olden days, a lot of buildings would be made from wood, which obviously forms a big fire hazard. So what would often happen is that entire buildings would just burn down. and this is also what happened to the old City Theatre in 1890. 4 years later, the new City Theatre would be constructed on the same spot, where it still stands to this day. Obviously, in this case, both form and function of the building remain intact. Nevertheless, museums and cultural hotspots like the City Theatre are hugely popular among tourists. Amsterdam has a total of 51 museums and 55 theatres and concert halls, where around 16,000 shows or concerts are being performed every year. Next, we will be taking a look at the old Leidsepoort, which is where Leidseplein got its name from. The Leidsepoort was built in 1664. It used to be one of the 8 main entry gates into the city, and these gates were in place to protect Amsterdam from outside attacks. We can see one of these attacks happen in the painting on the left, and this painting is meant to illustrate the Prussian invasion of Amsterdam, which happened in 1787. We can also see the drawbridge that was in place in front of the Leidseport. On the right, we can see an image of the Leidseport in 1860. We can see how the building has already lost a lot of its defensive functions. Sharp viewers might have spotted the old City Theatre, which we previously discussed, right next to Leidsepoort in the picture. Nowadays, of course, the American Hotel is located on the spot where the old Leidsepoort used to be. An original hotel was constructed in 1881, only to be taken down 20 years later in order to begin construction on a new hotel, which would be built in the Jugendstil style. This was an architectural style which was particularly popular in Europe around this time. The change from Leidseport to American Hotel shows, of course, one of the big influences that tourism has had on Amsterdam city centre. A building which used to have a defensive purpose in the olden days and became a historical building later on, only to be torn down to make room for a hotel, which was then also torn down to construct a new hotel in a more popular style. In the past decades, quite a few new hotels have been constructed in Amsterdam to accommodate the growing number of tourists. So many, in fact, that the City Council decided in 2016 to implement a construction freeze when it came to hotels. The idea was to refuse any new construction plans for hotels or hostels, with some room for exceptions. However, due to previously accepted building plans, we have still seen a growth of over 7,700 new hotel rooms in Amsterdam in the past 5 years. However, the City Council predicts that this growth will decrease when all the previously accepted hotels have been built. To conclude this collage, I will repeat my research question and try to answer it based on the topics that I've discussed. The question was, how have the form and functions of Amsterdam city centre changed in order to cater to tourism? Well, I think the biggest changes that tourism have caused are in function, not in form. We cannot forget that Amsterdam city centre is home to plenty of old buildings with historical value. While sometimes these buildings do get taken down to make place for more modern buildings, like we saw for example with the Leidsepoort, we also see very often that the form of a historical building is preserved as much as possible. The functions of these buildings often do change, however, to something that's more modern and more popular with tourists. This type of accommodating is a sort of middle ground, as the historical and architectural value of these buildings can still be appreciated, while the building also remains functional. So what will tourism in Amsterdam look like in the future? Well, for now, the number of tourists in the city centre has come to a screeching halt, of course due to the global crisis that's currently going on. This has had a negatively and sometimes disastrous effect on the economy of the tourism sector, especially on the smaller businesses, like the so-called mom-and-pop shops, which cater mostly to tourists. However, when the global crisis is over, I think tourism will once again rise in Amsterdam, and the city centre will have to adapt even more to these tourists. I think that it's possible that several historical buildings in the centre will get new functions, while mostly retaining their original form.